This is Duke University.
I'm going to stand up so as the faculty of divinity and just to say hello to everybody, and then I'm going to sit down and we can go from there.
Okay.
All right, I guess I am live. Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to, good. I'm sorry, I should have stopped so you can respond. Good afternoon, everyone. Fantastic. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm only standing up to sort of get us started, and then we're just going to sit down because we're just a bunch of friends talking, so I'm not going to stand up. But this is Duke University, the Divinity School Chapel, Goodson Chapel. Welcome to all of you. I'm Jay Cameron Carter. I'm on the faculty of the university, the faculty of the Divinity School. And again, we just want to welcome you to this event. And we will get started now. I'm going to sort of pass the mic, as it were, the lapel, to my dear friend and colleague, Professor Sarah Jane Cervenak.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Jane Cervenak, as Jay has already mentioned, and I teach at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. These opening remarks are dedicated to Keith Lamont Scott and Terence Crutcher. May their loved ones know the peace and comfort of their own design. We pray that the other world that respects such design and the unfettered time that comes with it is able to hear the call issued from this one, and that it gets through the barricades long enough to lovingly hold those who now negotiate the crimes that masquerade as explanation. Before we begin, please join us in a moment of silence in their names.
Thank you. We're going to, again, formally begin now. Sarah and I have composed a few opening remarks to sort of set the stage for what this event is about, to sort of give some opening explanations, again, about what this event is and the kind of work we're taking up here. And then we'll open it up we'll lead out of our comments into a conversation with our esteemed guests, who we will introduce in just a moment in the course of winding through these remarks. We'd like to now thank everyone here, our esteemed and invited guests, and all who have come here tonight, or this afternoon as it were, in and as a congregation of sorts, to experiment in what we call a communion otherwise, in an alternative mode of, shall we say, chapeling, or life together, which is nothing less than a practice of ensemble, which is to say a practice of study. Study is, can I get to the page, is a form of politics unhinged from property, from the proper, unhinged from propertied possession. Study as congregate thought is politics without a locus. As one of our esteemed guests has put it in her path-breaking work, Scenes of Subjection, and unlocused politics, or an unlocused form of communion, is what we, that is Sarah and I, have been calling the outdoors. But before going further into precisely the matters we want to talk about more extensively this afternoon, we want to continue our thanks by acknowledging a number of people and units within Duke University and other universities in the region that have made this event possible. First of all, we'd like to thank Duke University's Franklin Humanities Institute, particularly the Humanities Futures Initiative, for supporting this series. In particular, we thank Deborah Jensen, Chris Chia, Dean Rhodes, Pamela Moore, Pamela Montgomery, Sarah Rogers, and Eric Barstow. As well, we offer our thanks to all of the university sponsors at Duke University threw in money behind this event. The English Department, African American Studies, Women's Studies, the Literature Program, and the Religious Studies Department. We also want to give special mention to the Divinity School and our new visionary dean, Elaine Heath, who was unable to be here this afternoon, for granting us space in this chapel to do this work.
We are grateful We are grateful to the Women's and Gender Studies and the African American and African Diaspora Studies programs at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And finally, but this isn't the end, I'd like to think of thank you as resisting enclosure. I'd like to thank my friend, colleague, fellow student or studier, and co-conspirator, Dr. J. Cameron Carter, for the gift of the intellectual and creative collaborations, of which this series is one expression. Let's begin with where we are. What we like about this chapel is its windows. We wanted to talk outside, to gather in a space that spoke of the sacrality of aeration, of the unbounded, of outness itself. The windows aren't far from the altar, or should we say that the altar ain't far from the windows? Our contention is that the undecidable locale of light, sky, shadow, and air is precisely what is at stake and at issue. What opens up when we abide by this atmospheric, which is also metaphysical ambiguity, the church's uneasy comportment to the cosmos as both ornament and order. This moves in the church's pretense to making and breaking the outdoors. Steeple walls have historically and tenuously sought to harbor the theological, racial, and sexual traditions and counter-traditions, precisely as those traditions either make a claim for or respect what cannot be claimed, the unclaimability of atmosphere itself. It was Jean Toomer who tuned that there is no end to out. Atmospheric inhabitations index an alternative practice of the sacred, where walls and shadow windows become one with while shuttering out the unknowable holiness of all earthly life, breath, and spirit, where walls and windows bespeak and avoid the messages the neighboring trees send by way of their shadows.
What we like about this space is its windows, the indication of atmospheric presence and relationality of unbounded, deregulated gathering. The trees in the air are already inside this place, even as its architecture would suggest otherwise. The outside unsettles the inside, making the mortar, the brick, and prismatic glass maybe a little bit jealous of what it can't show. In her Maroon Studies poems inspired by Sylvia Wynter, Alexis Pauline Gumbs muses on this outside in a poem called I Wish for That Opening, and begins by sharing a passage, one that Wynter herself quotes from by novelist Hamidou Kane. In his novel, Ambiguous Adventure, Kane writes, "The future citadel will open its wide windows on the abyss, from which will come great gusts of shadow upon our shriveled bodies, our haggard brows. With all my soul, I wish for this opening." We too join Hamidou Kane wishing for that opening, one that Nate Mackey sounds out as the churchical. Churchicality is Mu, that concept inspired by multi-instrumentalist Don Cherry that Mackey develops in the opening essay of the poetry collection Splay Anthem, and in specific relationship to the ongoing serial poem that he's titled Mu. What is Mu? To ask this question is to start to approach the question we're asking, what is the Black outdoors? Mu is open or unfinished sound. The Mu of Mu may be the Mu in muse. The Mu in Mu may be the Mu in music. And the Mu in Mu may be the Mu in myth, mythos. But with respect to our year-long endeavor and the conversation this afternoon that opens it, the Mu of Mu is that ecological condition bound up with Blackness. Mu is outness, outsideness, if not outsiderness. It is the outdoors, that which resists enclosure. Indeed, that which brings sovereignty or the activity of the settler colonial online in an attempt to close the open. To come back to Mackey's formulation of churchicality, Mu we might think of as the ek in ecclesia, that Greek term that stands behind the theological and religious idea of church. Ek in Greek means out. Ecclesia means roughly the called or gathered, the congregated. Churchicality radicalizes the outness of the ek into some sort of deregulated, unfenced, unwalled, unbounded relationality in the break of the political as we know it, the politics of enclosure. The ek is the open, Edouard Glissant's open boat perhaps, and under common communion, the surreal presence, that consent not to be a single being that Glissant also talked about, another name for which is diaspora, or another name still perhaps the black outdoors, perhaps even the belly of the world. Mu is that wandering between aisles, within but eluding constraint. It is a rush of air, spirit of blackness, an alternative gathering, that blackness is somehow the practice thereof, bound up, we might say, with what Jack Spicer might call the practice of the outside, that Jean Toomer raised a tune to, as we already alluded to, there's no limit to out. The unfinished is Mu. It's the ektenchurchicality, the insofar, where the character of Beloved from Toni Morrison's epic novel says she's from, the ethereal space of sky and luminous darkness, what moves into and out of the makeshift storeroom out in the backyard.
The black outdoors is a long wish for that opening, the great gusts of shadow where life moves and is also withheld. An airy, earthy unsettlement of everything claimed to be held in rooms, all of those arbitrary and regulatory distinctions between sacred and secular, home and field, church and state, yours and mine, I and we. Convened here, we are all from the land of insofar, insofarians we be. Following Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, we returned to a chapel to launch this year-long series, The Black Outdoors, moving churchically in the break beyond debt, because we owe each other everything. Coming back to Alexis Gumbs' poem, she concludes by saying, quote, I wish for that opening where my prayer feels as productive as my work. I wish for that opening where I don't have to wish. I almost feel like saying at this point, let's pray, where prayer is another name for communion, another name for friendship, another name for study, where study here is nothing less than congregated, kinetic, haptic thinking. And having Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten and each and every one of you here, we're enacting what Sasha Engelman would call a pneumatic pact, an otherwise congregationality that, like a feedback loop, is both an outgrowth of our writing together, the pneumatography we've been about in the stuff we've been writing, but that also precedes our pneumatography as its condition of possibility. The name of this feedback loop is pneuma, spirit, conspiracy of revolution, breath, atmosphere, pre-individuated life, or what Fred Moten has called sociality, and what Saidiya Hartman has called some other state of freedom. We're involved in an atmospherics, an alternative sanctum, a practice of interanimation, an alternative animacy. The Black Outdoors is about this work, which can't be done alone. The Black Outdoors is about that love that Danish theologian Soren Kierkegaard, in opposition to Hegel, was trying to work out in his famed work, Works of Love. We say, welcome, Soren, to blackness. Welcome to this communion of outed outsiders, reveling in outness. Welcome to the Black Outdoors. And so that's why we're here this afternoon, and that's what this project, The Black Outdoors, is about, even if aboutness is a slippery exercise. That is, to think about blackness and outdoorsness and outness, to engage in some congregated thinking among friends, in the spirit of prayer, as the spirit of congregationing otherwise, in the spirit of prayer as the spirit of study, which is nothing less but always more than an alternative practice of getting together. Please join us in welcoming Fred Moten and Saidiya Hartman.
Fred Moten is professor of English at the University of California, Riverside. He has authored the groundbreaking, field-shifting, field-making book, In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, and with Stefano Harney, The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, as well as an ensemble of profound essays such as Blackness and Nothingness, Mysticism in the Flesh, and The Case of Blackness. Lastly, he has made and offered us such poetry collections as The Field Trio, B. Jenkins, and The Little Edges.
Saidiya Hartman is a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University. She has authored such groundbreaking, world-ending, world-harboring, and world-renewing books as Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, and Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route, as well as a number of field-changing and innovating essays as Venus in Two Acts, and most recently, The Belly of the World. We invited Saidiya and Fred to begin the conversation on the Black Outdoors because the kinds of worlds their works open up, enter into, move through, and ornamentalize bear the thickets, the breathy light, the tree-shrouded gathering of another way. This other way, the other path, uncleared and overgrown, threaded with untranscribable musics and wishes, the ethereal cast in Congress that is and cannot be reducible to the deeply non-performative dimensions of Black sociality, ambles in the intellectual, ecological, and aesthetic innovations enacted by their writing. Their writings carry the glimpse and glimmers of another proceeding, communions and conspiracies in the new ceilingless citadel where the bent church, bruised flesh, and impossible domesticity might finally get a hearing. So Jay and I have come up with some questions just to start a conversation, but we'll start with the one question and then we'll see what happens. Okay, our first question is, Saidiya and Fred, what emerges for you when you consider the phrase the Black Outdoors? How do you see it connected to the kinds of study you're engaged in?
We'll shift the tone and bring it down after all of those. You've given us so much to think about already. So should we just begin kind of casually? One of the places where I think about the outside, and I was thinking about this in relation to your provocation, as this kind of, constitutive paradox, and I'll return to Douglas when he talks about, the kind of thought in deed or the thought in song, and he talks about basically a philosophy of abolition that's made inside the circle of slavery. But he says that one only is able to give an account of it from the outside. And for me, one way of thinking about that is trying to think about that in some temporal relationship, which I think is wrong. Like, okay, then the outside comes after the inside. But I guess, thinking about it more recently, I was thinking, part of what that critical tradition is always trying to do is produce a thought of the outside while in the inside, right? That the kind of the enclosure is so brutal. But the practice is always about finding a way to produce an outside within that space. So that's one of the things I think about in terms of a project that I'm writing now on called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. It just seems for me that, a kind of a history of Black thought that's actually not the thought of canonical thinkers, but just, the thought of most folks is just really devoted to this labor of trying to produce an outside, trying to create an opening, which is often only discernible belatedly, and it's discernible as it becomes either marked as crime or as it's subject to a new form of enclosure that is the response to a certain kind of making and happening. And I guess the third thing I say that we will return to is just given, the kind of unceasing onslaught of kind of, militarized violence directed against, a civilian population I've been thinking a lot about the space of the hold and what happens there. And I think that part of, again, it's this other, I think that, and I don't know what Fred will say to this, but for me, part of the paradox is that, that the ordinary is constituted by stuff that is so terrible and impossible to bear, and yet in that context, people make things happen, right? They continue to act and to produce. But I think I want to keep those two things in tension, both the kind of the terror and the opening. What does it mean to kind of to try to experiment with living in the context of a world that is in so many ways uninhabitable?
Is this working? Okay. So, first of all, thank y'all for having us here. We've been talking about doing something like this for a long time, but y'all made it possible for us to, to kind of share our thoughts together and with a larger group of people. So I appreciate it. Appreciate all of y'all being here. So there's a couple things. One, I just thought of it really with that phrase, the thought of the outside, this idea just uttered, because it reminds me of a text that my old teacher, your old colleague Ann Banfield, used to teach all the time when I was in grad school. This kind of great essay by Foucault on Maurice Blanchot called The Thought of the Outside. And I think one way to think about it is that, the reason why we feel it necessary to constantly, I don't want to say constantly go back to the hold, but the reason why we maybe feel it necessary to renew our consciousness of being in the hold, so to speak, is because maybe there's a way in which the thought of the outside can only occur from the inside. And on the one hand, obviously, we speak in reverence, of the tradition of the thought of the outside, or the tradition of those who can figure out a way to be in two places at the same time, like that old, I always thought that was the real essence and beauty of incidents in the life of a slave girl, was that she was constantly figuring out how to be in two places at the same time, under absolute duress, often in both places. But there's a sense in which, obviously, the constant sort of renewal, of the terms and conditions of that inside-outside opposition are debilitating in many ways in and of themselves. And so it reminds me of this, like my mom came from this really small town in Arkansas called Kingsland, which only had like 300 people. And then there was another kind of town that wasn't even really a town, where my aunts and them lived, called New Edinburgh, which the people in Kingsland would call the country. And then there were people who lived so deep in the woods that we would refer to them as living out from New Edinburgh. Okay. So I guess I've been interested in trying to imagine something that would be out from the outside, or out, so to speak, of that inside-outside opposition. And it's, of course, hard not to think of yourself as being in some kind of infinity loop, or some kind of, Yayoi Kusama kind of infinity room or something like that. But that's when I think of the black outdoors or the black outside, I think of it as this thing which is about what it is to be out from the outside, or what it, or the conditions that would make such a thought possible and also necessary. So it's a meta out kind of thing, I guess you could say, or ek, or extra ecclesiastical, something, I don't know. But then I'll also say one other thing briefly. The thing that was in my mind all the time for the last 3 weeks was just, knowing I was coming back here after living here for 5.5 years, and me and my kids used to enjoy. We would just pull off the side of the road and go out in one of those trails and walk. Come to Eno River, these places like that. But there was always I could just always hear somebody running, basically. I just felt like in those instances of being out in the woods, that was for me where it was. I was closest to the runaway. And so I can't separate the outside from, this constant necessity and activity of running away, of flight, which therefore means that the outside is kind of always bringing those constraints with it, and it's impossible not to think about those things now, it's always impossible not to think about those things, but for some reason it just feels like there are more people getting shot these days. It's actually not true, but it just feels like it is.
Yeah, Jay and I were talking before we came over here today about Keith Lamont Scott and Terrence Crutcher, and we were talking about, particularly Keith Lamont Scott in Charlotte, who was sitting in his car, inside his car, right? And so we were reading a book, and we were thinking about how that space, which is, we could think about the space of the car as a domesticity, an impossible domesticity, like following your words idea, or as an enclosure or a fortress, but that it was already, the doors were already open, right? So that thinking about that, the movement, the way that blackness makes the difference between being inside and being surveilled, right? That it was already a window to look into.
Which is to say, invadable.
Right.
Right. Because it's sort of like following some of the remarks that you just said. As he's sitting in his car,
Right.
the car is already caught inside of the opposition between the inside and the outside, and that opposition can't help be a brutality.
Right.
To sort of think beyond that very dichotomy, to thinking out, as you would say, Fred, that's out even from that, right? And the kind of challenges even with that, right? Because it doesn't stop the bullets from flying.
Right.
One of the things that I thought was interesting, Fred, about this notion of the out from was that, so even in this space, what you're encountering is still that threat of enclosure or captivity. When you describe the out from, there's a lovely book on Marronage, and it talks about petit marronage or marronage on the border. And part of what it was is that people who were close enough to the plantation to still be caught, who were living in trees, who found a way to dwell in the forest, but they couldn't leave any marks of human habitation. And to me, that's a kind of an out from. So you escaped a certain kind of enclosure, but that threat, is there. So it's a kind, it's a certain dance. It's you've made this other mode of dwelling inside, often the trunk of trees. People are, living in the trunk of trees. They're not in this kind of relationship with the land that isn't displaying any signs of cultivation, but nonetheless, the threat hasn't been eliminated, right? And I think that for me is, and maybe this is kind of, like what I wrestle with, and partly it's just, just the the terror, the violence, the threat of enclosure, and the vulnerability, the precarity of these makings. I mean, and we continue to make and to create space because that's all we can do, right? And that's also produces opening, but it's, there's the kind of the structural container, the forces that are making living hard and impossible, and that those define so many of the circumstances in which these experiments in living unfold.
Well, it's like sometimes I feel like I just haven't been able to, well, y'all almost feel this. I just haven't been able to somehow I just can't quite figure out a good way to make myself clear, when it comes to certain things. And I don't think but I really feel like it's probably not my fault. I don't know that it's possible to be clear when it comes to these kinds of things. But let's say, and I get scared about saying certain kinds of stuff because I feel like sometimes it can seem really callous. And I don't want to seem that way, because it's not because I don't feel shit or because I don't care. But let's talk about it in terms of what it would mean to live in a way that would reveal or to show no signs of human habitation. Right? Obviously, there's a field or a space or a constraint, a container, a bounded space. Because every time you were saying unbounded, Jay, I kept thinking, is that right? I always remember Chomsky used to make this really interesting distinction that I don't think I ever really fully understood between that which was bounded but infinite and that which was unbounded but finite. Okay. So another way to put it, if it's unbounded, it's still finite, right? And there's a quite specific and often quite brutal finitude that structures whatever is going on within the general, if we can speak of what it is to be within the general framework of the unbounded, right? There's never, it's like, the whole point about escape is that it's like an activity, it's not an achievement. You don't ever get escaped. There's no like, I escaped. No, and what that means is what you're escaping from is always after you. It's always on you, like white on rice, so to speak, But the thing about it is that what's interesting to me, what I've been interested in, but it's hard to think about and talk about, would be that we can recognize the absolute horror, the unspeakable, incalculable terror and horror that accompanies the necessity of not leaving a trace of human inhabitation. And then there's the whole question of what would a life be that wasn't interested in leaving a trace of human habitation? So in church, in honor, just because my friend Ken requested it, fuck the human, fuck human habitation. That ain't, it's like, it's this necessity, the phrase I use sometimes, and I always think about it specifically in relation to Fannie Lou Hamer, because I feel like it's me just giving a spin on a theoretical formulation that she made in practice, right? Is to refuse that which has been refused to you, And that's what I'm interested in. And that doesn't mean that what's at stake is some kind of blind, happy, celebratory attitude towards all the beautiful stuff that we've made under constraint. I love all the beautiful stuff we've made under constraint, but I'm pretty sure I would love all the beautiful stuff we make out from under constraint better. But there's no way to get to that except through this. We can't go around this. You know, we got to fight through this, and that means that. And what it also means, by the same token, is that anybody who thinks that they can even come close to understanding, and I know you, when I say this, I'm saying I know you know this because I learned this from you. Anybody who thinks that they can understand how terrible the terror has been without understanding how beautiful the beauty has been against the grain of that terror is wrong. There is no calculus of the terror that can make a proper calculation without reference to that which resists it. It's just not possible. This is the key thing to me. It's like, you know, yeah.
It's almost like to be able to give an account of the terror, and even account here is okay, under qualification, but to approach an account of the terror, in some sense, it's from a vantage point that's both deeply related to that terror, but in some sense stands out from it in some way. And the outness of that standing out is out from the out that's conditioned by the inside itself, right? So in other words, it's already moving beyond the kind of bifurcation between the out and the in. You know, to give an account of the terror of the out and the in, right?
But I agree. Like, I mean, I'm not interested in that project of, re-enchanting human. So we're on the same page. And I guess I was wondering if part of what maybe accounts for the difference or the emphasis, it's not that you're not clear. I wonder if it's also what it means. I'm wondering if it's also the way in which I'm a historical thinker, right? Because when I think about those, those experiments in living, these forms of petit mouvement, and then how they come, to an end, not even an absolute end, because because then new practices emerge. But as I see it, I mean, there have always been, an endless number of beautiful models of living otherwise, right? That encounter defeat and then must reemerge, again. So it's not that you're like, insufficiently accounting for the terror. I think that maybe we're the shift. So my own thinking right now is, I guess I'm just really thinking about so we just have to be involved in that unceasing labor and producing these new experiments and living, even as defeat may continue to be a certain kind of outcome, but it's not that we're not stopped by that defeat, right? That it's not, as you said, to escape isn't finite. But I think that partly, as I'm understanding my now, it's, in relationship to all these other nows, and often what has kind of met those beautiful experiments is, certain forms of defeat by the state, by the police, by kind of reforming agents, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't mean that they, kill or quash or can snuff out that process, but that's just, that's also part of the field too.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. I remember, when you and Frank Wilderson had that interview, The Position of the Unthought, and you're kind of and in scenes too, you know, just messing with Jameson, you know, in the way that he kind of wants to, seems like he's a little, there's a kind of romanticism that goes with detachment, you know, around this notion of the narrative of defeat, which he thinks specifically in relation to like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And you know, it's an insufficient account, you know, I mean, and there's something, you know, it's problematic, you know. I thought part of the problem is, see, it's what if it turns out that the kinds of terror, the particular kind of history that we're trying to work through or talk about, you know, you as a historical thinker and me as a profoundly ahistorical kind of thinker, you know, but the particular history that we're working through in these different ways, it's like, it's not even really something that you can talk about within a calculus of victory and defeat. It's so, I mean, defeat is a word that, you know, one wants to, it seems applicable in many ways. And then, you know, there's the whole specific sort of Black Christian discourse on victory that one wants to appeal to every once in a while. But it just might be that, you know, really there's just, you know, part of the problem is that the concepts that we have been given to talk, you know, in order to try to think about and talk about the stuff we try and talk about just don't work. You know, they're inadequate, they're inoperative. I mean, it might even be the case that the concept itself is an inadequate sort of mental construct, or conceptualism itself is an inadequate sort of intellectual disposition with regard. I mean, it's just like we're working on some other kind of stuff, you know, and so you're constantly, I mean, I feel this reading your work all the time. It's like these things where you're saying these things using a given language, but I know you're talking about something else that's in some other language, see, and so you have to work through that, you know. You have to. It's a difficult thing, and I actually think about this and just I don't want to keep just. See, I think this is why. I mean, I think Black Studies now is reaching a kind of, I don't want to say, it's like a crisis in a certain kind of way. We just can't keep going on like this. That the conceptual apparatuses at our disposal are inadequate, and we're just kind of spinning our wheels in a lot of ways, you know, kind of reaching, you know, pushing up against the same hard rock, so to speak. And I think it doesn't mean that what's needed is a new kind of theoretical disposition. It's really a new set of kind of moral and ethical dispositions about how we treat one another and how we talk to one another. And it goes against the grain of any kind of sense of somebody being able to achieve an adequate theoretical sort of perspective on a thing by themselves. So I just feel like it's like a great relief to realize that at the same time that you realize you can't do it, that you realize I don't have to do it by myself anyway. So whatever is inadequate about what I'm doing, luckily you doing something, you know, luckily Sarah and Jay are doing something. I can't, you know, so it's just like, this is not a one person job, you know?
I agree with you. There are a number of things that come to mind. I mean, I think that we could say that that's, you know, the kind of inadequacy or incommensurability between an available critical vocabulary and that which we're trying to describe. We might think about this with Du Bois and the general strike. I mean, what he's trying to describe is so vast. And this is like, okay, maybe if I call it this, it can bring some stuff into the view about how this is a politics of refusal against capitalism and the conditions of work, even as it is so much more than that. So I, you know, agree with you about that inadequacy. I mean, I think that I feel like I'm involved in a much more humble labor. I feel like partly I think I'm trying to describe belatedly just the kind of the things people have thought and have done, and I'm just attending to them, you know? I mean, so it's this labor of regard, and it's, you know, and it too is tripped up or struggling with how to, you know, to illuminate that, because it's not that it isn't like a resource that we work with and in some way know, but it's this, it's a kind of intimate labor in regard to what others have done and have thought, and so I'm a describer.
I mean, there's so much. I'm still way back about what does it mean to live without leaving a trace of human inhabitation. And I'm thinking about that line from Beloved, where it's not just the footprints, but the water too. And thinking about what the water holds, that maybe the footprint attempts to contend with, maybe steal from, but what the water still holds. Yeah. So, I don't know, so that's one line of things I'm thinking about. But the other thing I was thinking about was this notion of authorship, too, when Jay and I started working together on this stuff, we would write something and then the sentences are different now because you're writing as part of a group. There is no soloist anymore. Everything is threaded together. Yes. Right? And so I think that it's deeply connected to this idea, this sort of the challenging of these notions of the solitary or the sovereign or of the author, right? And that the way another kind of writing sort of against or towards another kind of world is only done in that Nate Mackey way of being alongside oneself, right? Aaron Manning talks about it as the more than. What does it mean to kind of write, but then and feel the kind of not only the limitation of language, but also what language can hold and how it doesn't just hold. What language holds isn't just at the level of meaning. Does that make sense? I was thinking Gail Jones is a sculptor with words. She makes sculptures out of words. She doesn't just say something; she does something with words, right? And so. Anyway, it all sounds kind of convoluted, but I'm just thinking a bunch of different trains of thought at once.
It's the way in which I'm just sort of hearing what you're saying in relationship to what both of you just said is this kind of, and it has something to do with the outdoors, right. The way we're trying to think about the outdoors. Who came up with the notion? In some sense, it's irrelevant. Say kind of we writing together, thinking together came up with this notion of the new metagraphic, right? So it's like a form of writing, not pneumatology, but pneumatography, a kind of writing that's the enactment and the practice of a kind of communion, and that
a writing with. Yeah.
And in that sense, it's kind of almost like. The notion, insofar as the notion of the human is invested in the notion of the soloist. Right. In that sense, that we're trying to enact some sort of practice that's out from that, and you might even say that's kind of almost like parahuman of some sort like that. And we're trying to think, outdoors as this kind of congregationing, this different kind of congregationality.
Yeah, I see this idea in Venus in 2 Acts, which I actually just taught again this week in my class. Something that you do something else in your work, which is a kind of writing with, right? Or a sort of an ethical commitment to a writing with, that I think changes how we comport towards history, right? It's it doesn't feel like it's a writing about, but almost a communal kind of composition. Yeah.
So, anyway, that's just all triggered by the kinds of things that you all just said, and that sort of inspired us to want to, sort of do the communion, as it were, with y'all to try and think about that a little bit more, as a certain kind of moving against the grain of sort of thinking basically property, right? Mm-hmm. Thinking ownership, right? And maybe this gets to the kind of crisis that you might be intimating with respect to Black studies. A kind of mode of inquiry that's already swerved from propertization, right? The notion of the concept as a property or conceptualism as a kind of practice of property itself at the mode of thought, and then therefore is already inside of a kind of field of enclosure. And what does it mean to try and move otherwise from that, right? Another kind of inhabitation, with the tree, in the tree, right? And so like the kind of distinction between the tree and the me becomes kind of fuzzy at that point.
But Fred, I don't know if you want to talk about your the poetry as it's like just your writing practice, which is so rich and varied and multiple. If that.
I mean, I got to the point where there's so much overlap between the two things, and I don't think that, I kind of feel like it's, I never felt embarrassed about, being interested in theory, let's say. I never was all that invested in being called a theoretician either. I was just somebody who was interested in theory. And, in theory, in that kind of general sense of, just people seeing and thinking about stuff and trying to, and maybe certain movements of abstraction, from what one sees and what one feels. But also, theory with a kind of, in the way that term gets used when you're in grad school and it means certain authors, I was just like, I was always happy to be interested in doing that kind of stuff. And I was also always happy to be interested in poetry. And I never thought of these two things as being so utterly separate. And the older I get, the more impossible it is to keep them separate, but I do think that they both constitute, in the end, two different forms of description. I think it's the same work, I think it's funny, if there's it's like, I think some vague sense out in the world that me and you had an argument has been eclipsed by some other supposed arguments that we're in. So I don't think people seem to care that much about the fact that we're fighting anymore or whatever. But it wasn't no fight. It was just more like, me following around my big sister and annoying her while she was talking with her friends or some shit like that, But I would say that one way to think about it is that people have different approaches to things, and a lot of it's just kind of temperament, Like I was just at Clemson and they told me, well, you got to go. I'd never even been there before, it's just wrong how they do them kids, man. The center of the campus is John C. Calhoun's house, right? It's just like, come on now, It was like I met this young student, black woman named Edith, and she was at my talk, and I could just see from the look on her face that it was too much to ask of her to be at that place. And that just for her alone, they should dismantle that shit and build it someplace else, close to her where she lives. Like all of Clemson should be dismantled, taken down. They should bomb that place, pave it over, and then have Clemson where she wants to have it, But what I'm trying to get at is, the irony of it is they were like, oh, well, if you want to go have breakfast with your boys, there's a great breakfast place called the Sunnyside Cafe, I'm sitting there. So we went from the Sunnyside Cafe to John C. Calhoun's house, and the whole time I'm thinking of that, classic kind of old-timey song, Always Keep on the Sunny Side, which I love that song. And in a lot of ways, it's my temperament. You know, the way I do my work is I'm just kind of looking always for the sunny side. It's just that I can't, the peculiar nature of the sunny side with regard to Black social life is that it's dark, you know, and I can't, but I'm still looking for the sunny side. But I know that there are other people who are like, they don't need to look for the sunny side. They're more like, you know, midnight folks or 3 o'clock in the morning kind of folks, you know, like Bobby Blue Bland, you know, that kind of thing where every blues song happens at 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, my mom used to say, boy, she said, she talked about arthritis and said, and it always hurts the worst at 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, so luckily, everybody doesn't have to do the same thing. See? And what sad ethical condition are we in when it seems like when everybody has to do the same thing? Why does now everybody have to do the same thing? And people constantly writing these articles, you know, the state of this discipline, the state of that discipline. And it's always from the position, unspoken or not, that everybody should be doing the same thing. And whoever ain't doing the thing that I'm getting ready to say we should be doing is wrong. It's like, no, that's just stupid. You know, it's just ridiculous, actually. And it's, you know, so there's a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different attitudes, a bunch of different dispositions that are necessary in order to try to provide something that would approach an adequate description of who and what we are and who and what we might be.
So we have more questions. I just want to check our time really quick. 4 o'clock. Okay. So how about we ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience? Okay. Maybe number 2. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So in some ways, actually, let me back up a little bit. What's number 2? Okay. Saidiya, in the second half of Scenes, you offer profound meditation on what you call, quote, the incompatible predications of the freed, as sovereign, indivisible, and self-possessed, and as fungible and individuated subjects. What we originally were going to ask is that you elaborate how that incompatibility plays itself out with respect to the movement from plantation to home. And also just, and then sort of add, and we can all talk about this, how also that movement from plantation to home is constantly being interrupted, right, by the ungovernable assertion of the field.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, you may want to feel, because fields very particular resonance too. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. And I guess I'll say, you know, 2 things, and maybe it's a kind of gross simplification, but, you know, in certain liberal historiographies of slavery, it ends with a great, you know, legal act of emancipation. Writing Scenes and writing my dissertation, you know, there's the... Take this one off. Okay, I'm unmuted. So one was about trying to think about a certain the non-event of emancipation because of the way in which these these emergent modalities of servitude that took place within a discourse of freedom and rights and liberty, etc. But I guess there was something for me, I guess, like more rotten at the core, which is about the kind of the imposition of a certain regime of the subject that was so fundamentally defined by property, and that being as good as it gets, right? So I think that it was both a kind of, the impossibility of the achievement of those things that define a certain kind of liberal citizen subject in the West, the freed being excluded from that. But then what are the kind of the constituents of that subject to begin with? And is that something that one wants to sign on to anyway? And so many of the articulations of freedom, so much of the kind of the practices of the ex-slave or the freed articulated a kind of another imagination of freedom altogether. So there's the imposition of a certain regime of the subject, and the domestic is crucial. A certain conception of the domestic is crucial to the production of that subject.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that when we say field, I think that we're right. So that the field, on the one hand, in terms of that second half of scene, of the ways in which what sort of post-bellum citizenship looked like for Black people was a compulsion to work, right? So there was this compulsion to work the field, right, as part of something like legible citizenship or the capacity to have rights. But also, too, and this is something that Jay and I have started thinking about, and we're reading all this stuff in reading Anna Singh's work on mushroom collecting, which is really good.
Transformative mutualism.
Oh, yeah. And thinking about, Anna Singh has this great essay, I think it's called Unruly Companionship, but thinking about the ways that the production or the invention of this insistence on sovereign subjecthood and self-management, it was a deeply racial and sexual project, is coterminous with ecological management, right? So that the field emerges both as the space of the wild and of the governed at the same time. But it also carries this space where things need to be cultivated and managed, right? And so we were thinking about the way that the field travels, right? That the field on the one hand exists as land, flora, and fauna, but it also emerges as a certain discourse of not having it together.
Right. So it's almost like the field has to be fielded.
Right.
Right. So there's the field as the ungovernable, as the wild, as the sheerly possible. But then there's also the command to field that field, right? And so that the field itself then becomes this kind of terrain to be regulated. Right, and it's precisely the kind of interplay, tension, almost like deployment of a certain violence vis-a-vis the category of field that, in some sense, we want to think about in relationship to Blackness, or the as you say, the imposition of a regime of the subject. What also might be an imposition of the regime of the human, is somehow working in relationship to the imposition of the field as under management now.
Anna Singh, it is a wonderful book, talks about basically the plantation being that first exercise in an economy of scale, and that seeds and plants or humans are all cultivated for the production of capital in the same ways.
So it's ecology becomes a kind of racializing project at that moment, right? And so then the question becomes, well, what does it mean then to think the ecological, right? In that sense, both of the field, but in that sense that Fred talks about a sociality itself, to think it otherwise, right? In other words, to turn to the ecological as such ain't enough, because in a certain sense, it's been a certain deployment of a certain kind of eco-managerial regime, that's been at stake, right? The racism and the ecological have like almost been like folded into each other. So then what does it mean to think fielding beyond the field? Get out there, just a thought.
Different than like Sylvia Wynter thinking about the plot against the plantation, because she thinks about the provision ground in similar
And the way
ways.
that plot ambles both as strategy and as terrain, right? In the same way that the field emerges both to index like flora and fauna. Sorry, I know that there's other words, but flora and fauna, but also like a domain. It's just something that the field keeps emerging as precisely that third note. Like maybe the field in some ways feels like the outfield.
It's like Michael Brown walking down the middle of Ferguson Street.
Right.
I mean, in some sense, he's being fielded.
Right.
Right. And the street itself already sort of names a certain kind of fielding activity, a violent fielding activity.
Right.
So this gets us to that question we're messing with. Well, what are we talking about when we talk about the outdoors? And in some sense, the thought of blackness is working in relationship to this question.
I guess, again, I think, I guess I just feel like maybe, again, I guess I just feel this general sense of having come to an impasse in a certain kind of way. It's interesting. It depends on how you think about it. So let's say that within a field that is bounded by, on the one hand, the incompatible predications of the freed, to use Saidiya's terms, and then on the other hand, to use another of her terms, burdened individuation. That within the structure that is bounded, so to speak, by those terms, there's only so much you can do, theoretically. But that doesn't mean that you stop trying to come up with things. You see what I'm trying to say? It's like, because the other notion of predication has been in the back of my mind, a little bit the last couple months, is this notion of predication that Nate Mackey has, where he talks at a certain point about predication's rickety spin, And I guess I've just begun to think that, that what one might be able to do against the grain of the incompatibility of a set of imposed predications is to continually spin out in however rickety and raggedy way a kind of endless series of predications of the sort that, there was a certain moment in which, the critique of authenticity, let's say, in Black studies or whatever, became so kind of puritanical that any sentence of the type, blackness is X, was almost like against the law or against the rules, or you could, somebody would come get you, Touré or somebody, but I think that I'm interested in something like a kind of endless proliferation of sentences of the type blackness is X, recognizing that those sentences might come from anywhere and might be motivated or might be, animated by any number of different possible motivations. But that necessity of predication, which could even be said to take the form of a certain kind of a meditative kind of form, or even a worshipful kind of form if you wanted to, that's important, and I think it's one of those things that, in terms of describing what people have felt and what they've done, that's one of the things that people have done, and then by the same token, there is this other slightly, a parallel track to predication, which is maybe just naming or nominalization. These things they're kind of connected, but they're not exactly the same thing, I think. And these are important, cultural, aesthetic, intellectual activities that are crucial to anything like what might call a kind of, whatever you want to call it, resistance or fugitivity or, war, whatever. These are important activities to be engaged in. Because then it gives us a chance to think and talk, you see? That's the thing. It gives us a chance to be together as we meditate, with one another on these questions. Hopefully, with some friends, and some food and wine, and the kids are running around. This is totally important, it seems to me. And from my perspective, these are activities that kind of have to be done, to use the old Cornel West phrase, outside of the normative gaze of the white man. It's just at a certain point, you just can't be worried all the time about what he says and what he thinks. I mean, it's really, it's like, and for some reason, I think this is particularly difficult, for academics, because we are addicted to being graded, and they do the grading, but which is to say the degrading, but I think that, so that what I'm trying to say is that sense of, well, this is a term, is this the right term? That's a debilitating question, okay? But is this a term that we can start, that can get us talking about something? Is this a term that can help to structure a certain kind of fellowship amongst ourselves? That's a different kind of question. So.
Y'all, questions, join in. We welcome the conversation. Yes, please.
First, Sarah and Jay, thank you so much for organizing this. And Sadie and Fred, thank you so much for your comments and for your incredibly important work. One thing I was thinking of was if enclosure is the site of the terror and the violence, or at least part of the terror and the violence, if then the flip side to that is some form of flight fugitivity, another way of thinking the sort of response is emplacement. It's forms of collective placemaking. And so I was thinking about, like, with Petit Marronage, there's also Grand Marronage, right? In the effort to kind of create a separate polity, right, on complicated terms, or like the dwelling in the woods, like not like the human, is also potentially dwelling in the woods like an Indian, right? Or thinking about like Black Lives Matter coming to stand with the Standing Rock Sioux, thinking about all of these in relation to what does it mean to make place, right? What does it mean to think blackness in the Americas in relation to place, given histories of dispossession, terror, et cetera, and also given ongoing histories of settler colonialism. So just wondering if you could sort of think aloud about emplacement and black emplacement in relation to the kind of questions that you're raising.
Is that me? Is that somebody?
It could be me, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because, I mean, yes, you're right. It is about these forms of inhabiting. And I mean, I guess one thing comes to mind, which I love, which is, Du Bois's description of the Black Belts, which he talks about both as like a zone of enclosure, and he also talks about it as a huddling together, which gets to like how we make place together, even as there's a kind of the cordoning off of certain forms of social life because of the color line. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah, that's a part of it. I mean, I think what's interesting about the kind of the targeting And here the domestic comes into being because it seems that part of those assaults have been about these forms of inhabitation and affiliation and connection, the forms of, intimacy and kinship that look nothing like a heteropatriarchal arrangement, the forms of household that have all these people residing inside it that seem to have no discernible relationship. Those are all ways that people have made place together. In terms of quote unquote grand maroonage, state forms scare me. So I think that so much when we look at the history of even maroon communities that are actually able to create those complicated state forms, they're in a domain of politics where they're involved in these kind of treaty forms with slaveholding power. So for me, the petit maroonage is actually more, kind of consonant with my own thinking about just the kind of a history of anarchist projects, which have always described how we have lived, these kind of decentered, quote-unquote, headless societies. And it seems that there's a kind of potentiality there as opposed to, making an alternative that has to be legible within the terms of the given, as if, like our policy to counter their policy. Well, yeah.
Thank you. I'm, at fear of sort of iterating these problems. I'm always thinking of the problem of whether I might enclose because of others, because of the conditions of communality and any notion of communality and any kind of communality that I can think of risks the violence that I might do to other people, because because of my desires, or because that's where all of the kind of violences in a way that come from a certain kind of problem that we have. And so it's hard for me sometimes to think about this is where I have to become myself religious in my thinking, because I can't understand a mode of myself that doesn't give up on some level and suffer too, and even the idea of a congregation is, it's only the next time it gets together that I really feel like I believe in that, so that when I hear of it as a project, I find myself wrestling with that, because I'm always wondering, well, have you checked yourself, across the table? Have you asked yourself? What violences are you doing? And that seems absent a lot, like practices of people actually doing that and unfolding themselves. That's all I wanted to sort of say in relation to that. I'm in a way, sometimes I'm talking to Fred, and Fred knows this, because sometimes when I'm engaging with Fred, I come up against a sense of not that Fred does some kind of violence, not that he needs to check himself, because that's not what I mean, but I find myself caught, and so this does worry me. Is this just one of the the things you come up against, and does it need to be dispensed with? But that, was that just a promise that got said? Is that the way it is? I'll have that kind of sense sometimes. Why am I reacting that way? What is it that makes us not be in communion? And because there's also that. in all of these places and all of these times that people have ever been together.
Well, I guess just not to be cryptic or anything, but maybe, well, there's that phrase of about what it means to be sure of yourself, you know? But I mean it in a slightly different way. Not sure of yourself in the sense of confident or, competent, whatever, but sure of yourself as in sure that you are a self or sure that you have a self. So I would say that the less sure you are of yourself, the more possible it is to be in a community. And, luckily or unluckily for certain people in the population, they've had all kinds of, pseudo-intellectual, brutally, viciously juridical reasons to be unsure of themselves. So, so when it comes to that, it's the peculiar privileges of the underprivileged, the specific wealth of the poor, that makes, and there's a way to talk about that stuff too. So it's that thing where, well, anyway, that's all I would say.
I was just thinking the paradox. I was thinking the wealth of the poor, who are then more generous than the rich.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello? Oh, great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. The first question on placemaking made me think of something that I was trying to sort of put my foot on in my mouth as I was thinking about this throughout, which was that, and you just spoke to it in a kind of particular way, Fred, of, I guess, if to think placemaking in the context of Black Outside is necessarily to think about that that place or that space as provisional, which is to say that it's always susceptible to demolition, right? Whether it's slave quarters or whether it's the knocking down of homes for gentrification purposes or a freeway and these kinds of things, or in the case of a car as a temporary, like an always viable home space, or one of the examples, Fred, you always give, or I don't know if you always give it, but that you point out about something that Du Bois says in the Philadelphia Negro about the restrictions to be able to congregate on the street corner, right? So that even those kind of modes of placemaking are always provisional. And so I guess my question is that a way of saying that Black Outside is also like haunted by a certain relationship to temporality, which is like the imminence of that, its rupture or interruption or something like that?
Well, I mean, I think maybe this is connected to something Saidiya said at the very beginning about that feeling of wanting to be, outside of the circle of slavery is immediately something that shows up in temporal terms, which, because outside therefore meaning after. But in here, maybe what you're talking about, Tony, is that thing of like, even if you get out for a minute, they're coming, so you're gonna have to keep moving, because like you got hellhounds on your trail, so that it's a weird way. You're haunted by by your own by a mobility, a forced mobility that constitutes your future or something like that. But I don't know, I'm not trying to say that I have anything like an adequate understanding of the work, but one of the things that I have been able to derive, I would say, from really trying to study hard and read Frank Wilderson's work hard is, like he'll say, like in Incognegro, that he talks about wanting to have a place and time in the universe, or not wanting to be a cosmic hobo, But then he also says that, that the condition of the black is the condition of this sort of radical non-contemporaneity, that we don't have a place and time in this universe. We're outside of that spatio-temporality as its guarantor in some kind of weird instrumental way. And I would say maybe and I just feel like his analytic of the way he recognizes that what it is to be a subject is precisely to have a place and time, and that the term we use to describe that place and time, the term we actually use for those coordinates is body, and then that links it back up to Spillers' work, where the theft of body is literally the theft of a place and a time, the theft of the very capacity for placement in the way that you've been describing. But then maybe what that means is that the petit mélange is how you proceed outside of the desire for a place and time, outside of the desire even for a body, claiming the monstrosity of the flesh, as Spillers would say, And so what that means is that it's a disruption of a sort of normative, maybe, kind of a Newtonian sense of space and time, that we are somehow, that's the nature of our, experiment, so it's like, I just keep thinking, remember Ray Parker Jr. and Radio? That's on two places. I keep thinking of it at two places in the same time, But here, the two places in the same time, inside you and inside your mind. I still don't know what that means. But what we're talking about maybe would be two places at the same time. One of those places is a place that is defined by the capacity to have a place and a time, and the other is not. So it's like again, you just keep butting your head up against inadequate terminology.
An impossible but necessary precondition.
I don't know, Tony, man. I'm tired. I'm just going to believe that what you just said is right. And
I hope I did too, Fred. Niece is trying to get after. I'm thinking about De Silva. I'm thinking about all her stuff about, the end of the world, which may be an end of a certain way of thinking about space-time. So I'm thinking about that on the one hand. And then, of course, Césaire has his own formulation of that. I'm thinking in the Cahiers, where, again, it's about a temporality that's not moving according to the temporality of, as you say, the coordinates of the body or the coordinates of the human as it has been given to us as an overdetermined. Silva would say by the figure of man. But it just brought Silva to mind.
Yeah, because, it's an interesting phenomenon that manifests itself in a bunch of different ways, where there's just a whole bunch of people there's people I know, Denise De Silva is interested in physics and quantum mechanics, and Michelle Wright is working along these same lines in a different kind of way. But then, Denise is also interested in tarot, and so, or like, there's this really interesting book, I can't think of the guy who wrote it, that's talking about quantum mechanics in voodoo. It's like, you know, and these things are things that you could trace back to these old sort of black folk tales. I mean, I had this book when I was little called Black Folk Tales by Julius Lester. You know this book? I mean, and it was all about people who could fly. I mean, in other words, it's just a part of what the experiment requires is a really radical kind of, whatever you want to call it, transdisciplinary intellectual practice. There's a long tradition of it, and it moves along these lines because it all has to do with the fact that, you know, that we just ain't quite here or now. And there's a tremendous history of violence that undergirds that, and it also constitutes an amazing chance, you know, and you got to think about a lot of different weird kind of stuff to try to figure it out. And that's what everybody does. Everybody that I knew growing up did in all their different ways, you know. I mean, I remember like in AJ's movie, and you were talking about all the boys that you knew who had now been killed or gone, or, you know, and I was thinking, well, when you think about losing folks, what you're losing also is all that they were, you realize over the course of time that they were, like you said, they were thinking about this stuff all the time. Like Junior Roberson was thinking about this stuff all the time when we were playing basketball. I mean, it's almost like the way people were playing, the way people, 6, 7 years old, we had already somehow been brought up within it was as if we already knew we were supposed to be thinking about these things, you know? I mean, it's very, and what you lose when you lose somebody is not just them, but they, you know, it's like the whole fabric of this rich sort of intellectual, social field in a different sense of the term that you've been, or plain, how about that? That's a meadow or whatever. That's what you've been losing. It's like they tore a hole in it, you know? They keep tearing holes in a fabric, you know?
Earlier, Jay and Sarah were also talking about, you know, the impossible domestic, and thinking of Scott and his car, but seeing, you know, Corinne Gaines in her apartment with her son, and just that impossible scene where, you know, she's extending her love and saying, well, and you know what awaits you. You know what they're here to do. I mean, it's related to this. It's like, and he says, yes, Mom, they're here to kill us, right? And he's not wrong, but just that he must bear that knowledge at age 5.
Usually gonna go over there or here. Yes. I've been thinking a lot about the how to, you know, find myself in a position of, you know, the community I'm from Brazil. So the community I come from, and working with popular education for many years before coming to graduate school, and then going back, and all of a sudden being identified as an outsider, doubly, right? So someone who's bringing new ideas from the north, and I'm, you know, been reading Afro-pessimism from here, and, you know, and then also from being an academic. And one of the sort of concepts that I was, you know, talking about my peers in Brazil was all this idea of that Wilderson talks about, of a grammar of suffering that's unintelligible, or you know, the incompatible predicament. So how is it that we, even when we are amongst our peers or here, or go to NC, cut through the isolation, but in a way that we are able to identify I use sort of a, I guess what I'm to be, it's hard to be short when talking about this. It's very emotionally loaded. But, so I've been studying a lot nonviolent communication techniques, and one of the steps is in order for us to have any kind of communication that's compassionate, or you can you need to be met in your needs. So one is identifying, for example, observation from interpretation, because it's one thing if you walk in here and you don't see me, or I can just assume that you're being racist against me, right? Or maybe you just had a bad day. So like, why didn't you talk to me, or why did you muffle my voice so many times, as opposed to why I think you did it, right? And then the next one is like feelings and thinking. So I have a feeling that the chair of my department is trying to boycott me, versus, I think that because this has happened, this and then that time, I assume. So it's, feeling from assumption. And then I need is like identifying a need and then making a clear request. And when we are like going to the places where our people are, which is for the most part not here, and we are creating a situation where we're actually inviting ourselves and them to talk about these issues that are so heavily loaded. And we come very unprepared from being trained in modalities of communication that's only verbal. And that's from being trained to a bit inhabit here and leave no traces of how we inhabit our hearts, right? So we come into this really loaded and conversations, and we're raising all this very heady and intellectual propositions, trying to understand the black geographies in Rio, and why is it that the current stock market building is where the slave building was built physically. And so how is it that you might have seen that you use other methodologies or pedagogies or approaches to work with the regard and to address the needs in ways that going beyond what can be understood or communicated, it's also trying to understand needs and meet the need for creating compassion in a way that, we don't read these things and talk about these things, and all we want to do is to hate.
There's so much in what you said. I mean, one thing, I'm hopeful, and I'm hopeful because I feel that lots of people have the understanding that we need an end to this order, and who are thinking about creating, alternatives. So I'm interested in experiments in living. So one thing is like, so what is the relationship of maybe this space to, when you go back to the community that you're from in Brazil, and I know Sarah and Jay are into like, Manning and the Sense Lab, but one of the things I've been thinking about is like the notion of a mutual aid society, right? And this is a kind of historic form of like Black gathering, and that is that we actually have tools to help and to aid one another. So it's just not simply like putting a lot of stuff on the table, but then not having a modality of healing and attending to one another that's a part of that work. And recently at a show at the New Museum, Ame Cox, who's written this wonderful book called Shapeshifters, she was doing these like healing modalities weekly as a part of the work that they were doing there. So I feel that the notion of people's practice is becoming really, really rich, and that people aren't only working in one domain and in one way. So I think that that's exciting, and I think that your question speaks to that need to work in these multiple ways. And another part that I heard was like, you know, how we're involved in these forms of intellectual address or encounter or engagement. And I mean, I feel like I'm always a part of a collective utterance. I mean, Sarah and Jay raised this earlier. It's not about a single authored work. I mean, even something that has my name on it, I'm like, is any of this actually mine? So there is this kind of collective project, right, that is, you know, committed to a certain kind of process, is animated by a certain kind of imagination. And there's a lot of resource and food there, you know, spiritual food, healing food. So in that sense, I mean, you know, even in this incredible, you know, moment, and first of all, you know, we've always been murdered, yes, but I don't know that, you know, I mean, I think part of the intensity is that we're experiencing the brutality under the regime of hope, and we're actually witnessing each of those killings in a way, right? So just which doesn't make them any more so, but there's something about that that is different. So in this, though, in the pressure of all of this, I just see people making alternative ensembles, associations, opening freedom schools, constructing syllabi, creating spaces of study, thinking about how to, like, you know, be outside this credit system, trying to have like their own forms. I don't know. So I think that there's a lot of stuff happening too. So.
Is this on? Oh. Actually, I'm not sure whether I have a question or I would like to make a comment, and maybe that you could respond to it. But I think that maybe what I have to say, something that I read last night, it's rich enough to maybe respond to many things, even the last person who just spoke, and certainly things about the inside and the outside. And I'm just recounting shortly, because I can't do it verbatim, a story that probably both of you know, and I had just read it for the first time last night, in really the introduction to Paul Taylor's new book on Black aesthetics. And he recounts the story of, actually it was the story took place on a slave ship that had just landed, I believe, in Suriname. And so the black slaves are coming up out of the hold, and the person who had recounted this, who had seen this, he said, you know, they looked like you would expect, dark-skinned, slender, sick, some of them, etc. He said, except for one feature, they had stars in their hair. And so then the capitalist, one looking to buy them, said to the captain of the ship, I mean, what did you do to them? And he said, no. He said, these niggers did it to each other. He said, they took razors and without soap, and they carved stars in their hair, and they carved half moons. So when you're speaking about the inside and the outside, I think about inside there, in the hold, in the dark, people of different languages carving something so outside, way out. They didn't carve just anything. They carved stars and they carved half moons. I think about the outside that they come to. First they're aboard that ship, what happens to them there. I think about then the out from that. So there always seems to be an out from an out from an out from an out. And that next out for many of them will be a field. And I think about what a black man said to me in Dominica quite recently. We were both talking about a little girl who had just been raped, and then he was just talking to me about growing up and life. And he said to me, anything can happen in a field. So, touched there about the in and the out, but also the refusal, if you'd like, to not leave a trace of their humanity. The refusal to say, okay, you might want to take our freedom, but we were still free there to actually do violence to ourselves. That's why I think it's very interesting that he points out they did it without soap. They did it with razors. They don't necessarily speak the same languages. They are in the dark. They are in the hold. And they come up with this how. I'll just put one thing on this. I once had someone very close to me who was killed by the police. And he also spent 15 years in prison, and actually when he got out, it was because it turned out, as he had known all along, that he was in there on trumped-up charges anyway. But when he got out, he said to me, I'm feeling a little ashamed because I almost feel like I want to be back in there. He said, I'm back out here, outside. He was involved in the streets, gang members and stuff. He said, they're so unorganized. He said, for example, inside, sometimes we did this thing. He said, and I don't know how they did it, just like I don't know how they did that in the hold. We'd all be in our separate cells. And then somehow they figured out how to have a countdown, but they didn't do it out loud. They did it silently, and then they would all say, machine, and it would echo in the prison, and then people like him, who they thought were the ringleaders, would get in trouble, because you see, they weren't even allowed to do that together, collectively, to say the word machine out loud together signaled some kind of freedom that frightened the authorities in the prison.
I want to say something, but I don't know how to make it follow smoothly from these two extraordinary stories that you've told, but in my mind they do follow. And I guess, I feel like maybe I'm a literal-minded kind of reader. So, and for me, in terms of my work, the two most, important texts for the work I've done, that I've been trying to do, for the past, 20 years or whatever, it's basically, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, and Scenes of Subjection. And there's certain points in those texts, and I just take them totally literally. Like, I'm just like, I read scenes, I'm like, okay, Indian, fuck the subject. Don't want it. Don't want to be one. Won't be one. Refuse to be one. Okay? And similarly, Spillers, maybe I've never had a chance to really talk to Professor Spillers about this, and maybe it's more fundamentalist than she wants to be taken. But I'm like, fuck a body. Don't want one. Ain't got one, don't want one. No such thing anyway. Nobody really has one. I just know I don't have one. So if y'all get it straight, then maybe we'd all be better off, So when you tell those stories, for me, part of what's really rich and important and interesting about those stories is that they really are not predicated on a whole range of pieties regarding individual subjectivity or the body, it seems to me. And see, part of what so I get really wary when I feel like, with all good intentions, and under the most vicious forms of duress and coercion, a set of assertions are being made in relation to both past and current brutalities that are kind of predicated on a certain kind of piety with regard to the body, subjectivity, even a certain notion of polity. So I know I'm not really speaking in a very clear and emphatic way, because I don't want to It's just that what you're talking about, it seems to me, is about something deeper than just some stuff that happens to would-be subjects who want to be free. It's deeper than that. And they're deeper than that, you know? And it's important, you know, to keep on trying to meditate on that. And not just to meditate on it, but to keep on trying to practice what they were practicing there. Because they were engaged in a practice, you know, in that kind of deep kind of thing that lets you know from the very beginning that there is no separation between violence and the aesthetic. Jazz is just a form of violence, you know, and it has to be, you know. It doesn't ameliorate violence or cover over violence. It enacts violence. It messes people up, you know, which is what it's supposed to do. So I just want to, just say that this is why, you know, for me, these things that we're talking about, these particular forms of violence that we endure today, you know, in the regime of hope, you know, which hopefully will end soon, you know. I keep thinking maybe these two clowns are so bad, maybe they'll just say, let's just, hell, we can't do no better, let's just have him back, you know. It's just, what's that amendment? They'll be like, anyway, but I'm glad for it to be over myself. But the thing about it is like, what we have is, you know, as Jay was saying, it's an ecological disaster. It's deeper than just being a human catastrophe, you know. And I just feel like it's really important to be mindful of that. Even if the language that we sometimes have to use in order to respond to the catastrophe is a kind of residual language of humanism. Maybe that's unavoidable sometimes, but still, there's this other thing about it that's going on, it seems to me. So.
Hey, oh, sorry. First off, I want to thank the last two people who gave questions and comments. I was really moved by what you had to say, so I want to say thank you. I just came from Charlotte yesterday, so that's on my mind a lot. And you have these two examples of this jarring clash between what's told and what is. Of course, you know, in the case of Keith Scott, where his family says he was reading a book, but the majority of people will always know it as a gun. And then you have a protester who everyone on the ground who was near the protester says he was killed by police. And they'll say, I saw this with my own eyes. And how that doesn't matter, because the majority of people will always retell the story that it was a civilian. And then on a lighter note, I thought what you said, Fred, the peculiar nature of the sunny side was so spot on. There was these two moments, one being when we're outside the jail, and then there are people in the jail flickering lights, and it looked like stars, and it was beautiful, but it's also people who are in bondage. And then this was just a matter of 4 of us, and we're outside the jail, and this young man, John, who had just been released from protesting the night previously, is mouthing off to this cop who's dressed as a soldier, who has an assault rifle on his belt. And he doesn't give a shit. He's just going off and being like, what are you gonna do, bring me back to the 3rd floor? And it was incredible, but then wondering how much that matters when in the recorded narrative of what's happening in Charlotte, only a handful of people will ever know that those things happened. And I guess the reason why I've been thinking about this a lot as a writer and as an activist is I've been thinking about the truth, and how when you believe that there's an outside, that there's an out, and you're like, there's no way this is it, like there's got to be something else that's better, the response that you're often going to get is, what's wrong with you? And I guess my question is, if you do believe in an outside and you're willing to fight for an outside, does that mean that you just have to divest from truth? Or if truth-telling is still a worthy labor, how do you overcome this yearning to be believed? Because you see the cycle over and over again. When someone's killed by the police, people are like, no, you're not telling the truth, right? And I'm wondering, do we just keep doing that? Do we just keep fighting this exhausting fight to say there is a truth that you need to believe? Or do we just say, fuck it, I don't have a body, right? Or, some other way of going about it.
Well, who is it? Who do you want to believe in?
That's a good question.
I mean, maybe there's some people who you might say, well, they'll never believe you. But, maybe they'll come to believe you too, but you can't worry about them. You just can't worry about them. I don't know. Getting old. I feel like we were good. We never got in trouble. We got good grades, went to so-called good schools. And the reward we got for being good all that time is you got to spend all this time around people who are trying to kill us. So I guess I just unavoidably have nostalgia for the time I spent around a whole bunch of people who weren't trying to kill me. I just kind of want to talk to them at this point. And I don't have any kind of a priori exclusionary formulations about who might be in that group. But I'm just not, I deal with the ones who are trying to kill me when I have to deal with them. It's usually about my check. And in this respect, I feel like I'm just like my father and his father before him, dealing with these people, and it's about my check, and other than that, I'm just like, please, leave me alone. Now, okay, they don't leave you alone. I understand that. But so the question is, I think there are alternative modes of cultivation. How do we cultivate, and alternative modes of cultivation that then in turn produce possibilities and capacities of self-defense, and that self-defense is anticipatory. It isn't responding to the murder after the fact, it's figuring out ways to prevent the murder, sometimes. Sometimes you can't. But I just feel like when it comes to those kinds of things, which are really matters of like what Spillers would call interior intersubjectivity, or the intramural. When it comes to these intramural matters, we just got some work to do, I just don't, I worked here for a long time, 5 years, and it became clear to me over the course of time that there are certain people who I had to work with on a day-to-day basis who had, not the kind of opinion about the value of the work I was trying to do that I would want them to have had. Wasn't so much that they had a bad opinion about what I was doing specifically, they just had a bad opinion about the kind of thing I was doing, about the kind of stuff I was reading or the kind of stuff I was studying. And it produced certain issues around my paycheck that had to be dealt with. But I don't give a fuck about what they actually think about. I care about what she thinks about what I'm doing. But I don't care about what certain other people think about what I'm doing. I can't worry about them, because all they'll do is mess up my capacity to do what I'm trying to do, which is already impaired by any number of things. I just can't worry about them, It's, you know, someday, you know, yeah, you know, I just you know, I'm not trying to discount the complications and the difficulties that really emerge as a function of having to worry about your check. And that requires us, again, forms of mutual aid and social aid that we have to engage in. But we can't, but like recognition in some sort of Hegelian, no, hell no, they can't, no. It's like, you know, there's certain stuff your dog can do, and then there's certain stuff your dog can't do, you know? You know, you want your dog to, you know, we bullshit ourselves into thinking that our dogs are saying, hello, how are you? You know, when they come in. They're kind of basically saying, I'm hungry, I want to go outside, you know? And you are the instrument through which that can happen, so get to work, you know? We give them all these qualities, and it's cool, and I like dogs, I'm just saying, why are you asking things from people that they're not capable of doing yet? You know, so why wait? You know, a residual effect of the work we have to do amongst ourselves might be that they get more capable, which would be nice, you know, and we would welcome that. But no, you know, you read the comment sections, man, they're like, he got what he deserved. He raised his hands. If he had just followed the cop's instructions, you know, don't hold your breath until that person says, you know, I see your point. You know?
I think I just want to, you know, echo what you're saying, Fred, and it goes back to this question, not so much of when will they believe, but just, you know, I mean, in their introduction, they were talking about the explanation that is itself a form of violence, or the lies of the civil discourse, of the discourse of recognition, and thinking about the absolute necessity of creating these other domains, having certain kinds of discussions in the space of, you know, the collectivity that's yet to be, or in the intramural, because, I mean, you know, what's required to prevent another death. And when I was looking at Corinne Gaines, I was thinking of Ida B. Wells. And she, I mean, you know, she said a Winchester in every household, as she was imagining people confronting the specter of this extra state terror, except that terror is, you know, is the terror of the kind of the state forces. So what do we do in this meantime when there's nothing that we can do that's about being trained, being dutiful, having hands raised? So that's actually just clear, right? And that question of, so what do we do in the meantime, is one that we really have to take up in a domain that's not about the performance for a public.
Questions, and we could keep going, but we have committed to ending at 5 o'clock, so I do apologize to everyone we didn't get to. That said, can we just all give a round of applause to Sophia Hartman? As we finish up now and get ready to depart, I just want to also just invite you all to stay on the lookout. There are going to be several other events throughout the course of this academic year that is a part of the Black Outdoors as a series. This is the opening of the series with this conversation, this wonderful kickoff conversation, but there are many, many more things to come. So again, please be on the lookout. We invite you to these things. Have a great evening and a great weekend.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.